It takes place online. And so I think the slur of Internet Austrian is no longer applicable. And in fact, a lot of the energy we see is what it comes from what we can call loosely FinTwit or econ Twitter. We have people like Safety Anonymous, people like Lynn Alden, people like Larry Leopard writing pretty substantial books about money. They're not treatises in the academic sense of the word, but nonetheless, once again, it seems like people who are at least tangentially involved with the Austrian school, kind of outside of the institution. And so, Austrians are not so much in politics, especially in the United States. But it almost feels like the academic institutions, the universities, but even the think tank and NGO institutions are no longer where the action is. And the sociology is important. And by sociology, we mean the culture of the school, the development of the school, the intellectual family tree, the divisions, the groups, the milestones of years, the little interpersonal squabbles. All this stuff is very, very important if you're interested in seeing Austrian economics grow. Because let's remember, the sociology affects the theory. And I would say the theory reflects the sociology. Let's say Hayek or Rothbard or Mises had really gotten that cushy top-tier university academic position full-time that they so richly deserved. Maybe Mises wouldn't have written Human Action in the late 40s in a brand new language. Maybe Rothbard wouldn't have written Man, Economy, and State if he didn't have support over the years outside of having to teach a bunch of classes or produce a bunch of papers. So the interpersonal stuff really matters, little squabbles. And so when we think of a family tree, we start off with this big tree trunk, which is Menger and von Bauerberg, and we're talking about maybe the classic period in Austrian economics, the 1800s. Getting into the 20th century, and then you start to have translations into English and other languages of the main key books. And then you have what we might call this down period, this wilderness period, maybe from the 30s, depending on how you want to view it. Keynes comes onto the scene, and there's a Great Depression, there's a big Second World War, and all these things kind of put the Austrian school on the back burner for a while. And it really isn't until what's colloquially referred to as revival in the 1970s, which is a couple of events. First of all, the South Royalton Conference happening in 1974, and also Hayek, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, receiving the Nobel Prize. Both of these were shots in the arm for the school, and there was a bit of resurgence. And so from that resurgence, that tree trunk I described earlier starts to develop some branches. There's kind of off of Mises and Menger von Bauerberg, there's kind of a branch that goes off with let's say Hayek and Kerzner off into kind of the George Mason, Cato end of things. And then there's a branch that goes off with Rothbard and Hoppe that goes off into more of the Mises Institute end of things. And there's all kinds of internecine fighting over things like fractional reserve banking, over actual methodology, hermeneutics, versus pure praxeology. All these things which are fascinating to those of us who just have an interest in this. Maybe we're sort of nerdy in the sense that this isn't what we do for a living, but nonetheless, with Bitcoin and Malay, I think we are perhaps seeing a new turn of the Austrian school where it's more and more online. It's getting out of that oppositional phase, the late 19th, early 20th century, and everything seemed to be either neoconservatism or neoliberalism, and Austrianism was just, opposed, always against supply-siderism and militarism and welfarism, whereas now it seems like we need to turn out of that phase into a new phase where we're actually a little bit more bold, a little more confident, and out there in the world saying, hey, we have some insights that are correct and true, and can make the world a better place. So I hope that is the next turn. And this is an open question when it comes to Bitcoin. Has Bitcoin brought more people to Austrian economics, or has Austrian economics brought more people to Bitcoin? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a very interesting question. So all that said, I won't speak too long. I'll try to finish not too far after the bottom of the hour for some questions, but I'd like to turn to my pet topic in life, which is language. I'd like to talk a little bit about language in Austrian economics. And I would like to make the case that actually Austrians should care a lot more about language than perhaps they do, pay a lot more attention to linguistics as a social science than perhaps they do. Now, why is that? Well, there's a variety of reasons, I would argue. First and foremost, Mises had this quote, which is kind of funny in Human Action, beginning one of the chapters, where he says, there have even been, I'm quoting him, there have even been economists who held that the only appropriate method of dealing with economic problems, mathematical method, who derided the logical economists as literary economists. And so I like that expression, literary economists. If you open Human Action, 900 pages, there's no formulas, there's no equations. There's a few in Man, Economy, and State, but basically it's just dense text. And that's why I think people like Paul Krugman, oh my God, what is this? What's cranky philosophy? And especially part one of Human Action, right? Well, that's logic, that's rhetoric, that's a lot of things. And language is the essential building block, I would argue. Skillful language is an essential tool, a building block for any economist, and math is not. Math is helpful, of course, but it's not the building block. And so if we are against, let's say, formalism, formalism mathematically or otherwise in economics, if we're against ambiguity, we're for precision, language is part of our means ends, well, then I think we ought to pay more attention to it. And, there's been some articles and some attention paid over the years to this. Hayek in 1968 wrote an article called The Confusion of Language and Political Thought, and he really sort of bemoans this idea. It's a short article, but Institute of Economic Affairs, I believe, published it. It's 1968 is what my notes say. He said, well, we're really hampered by these earlier modes of thought. And of course, thought cannot be separated from language. If you go read Theory and History by Mises, he laments this sort of historicism and people being so enthralled with their own civilizational modes that they can't evolve into a capitalist, wealthier system. But a lot of that has to do with thinking, and thinking and language, I would argue, are so densely interrelated you can't really even separate them. We think in words, concepts. We make concepts in words. So backing up a little bit, and all of this, or much of this, is found in a paper I wrote a couple of years ago for an Italian journal called Etica e Politica. The paper's called Evolution or Corruption, the Imposition of Political Language in the West Today. Now, it's a little bit more about politics and other things than economics per se, but it does draw some analogy in economics. So for starters, I mentioned we don't tend to think about language too much, but first and foremost, language is a tool. Language is like a hammer, right? You see some guy about to step off the street and get hit by a bus, you say, hey, watch out. There you're using language in its most blunt and immediate way. And the message you convey to the guy, you don't just say something gibberish. You say, watch out. You're coding explicit meaning to that guy or gal so they step off the curb and don't get hit by the bus. So in that sense, language is a tool. But if we go a little broader, language is not only that interpersonal tool, the way we navigate our day-to-day human interaction, but it's also the core of cognition and learning. So language, if you listen to people like Noam Chomsky, I guess, did he die? I forget. I guess he might have died the last year. But nonetheless, linguists like Noam Chomsky will tell you, how we learn language is how we learn everything. So language is our cognitive tool for conception. It's how we conceptualize everything. Even our dreams, for example, have a language element to them. And so if we look at a human endeavor that has its own expressions or its own modes or something outside of pure written English, and probably many people, not all, but many people on this server today are native English speakers. So we tend to have English as our That's we dream in English, we speak English, we think in English. Um, but even modes like music and mathematics, which have a language of their own, which is not English. Mathematics has numbers and formulas, equations, and music has notes and scales and bars and tempos, symbols. Um, Even then, the way we conceptualize mathematical concepts and musical concepts, let's say a point on a graph that we're graphing in geometry or algebra, or understanding a note somewhere on a scale. Music, even then, we're thinking of those things, we're understanding them, we're conceptualizing them in English, in our native tongue. So beyond just a tool, your language is really at the heart of all cognition. So if we go even higher, we can take this one step further and say, wait a minute, language is actually an institution in society. That's a broad statement. That's a bold statement, and it's one that I don't know about the rest of you, but I had never really thought that way till I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. Um, and I'll get to this, but the first time I really thought about it was reading Luis Soto's Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles, which seems like an odd introduction to that concept, but that's where it is, among other places. But I would just say that as an aside, Austrian economics tends to ignore the institution of language, but it doesn't ignore it. It pays a lot of attention to academic institutions, pays a lot of attention to government institutions, pays a lot of attention to market institutions, but not much attention to language. Um, so I would argue that there's a broad opening there for, let's say, interdisciplinary work, however you want to characterize it, with linguists. And I've got an excellent example of that in the form of a paper. So, not my paper, someone else's that I will get to. But so if we go to the aforementioned Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles treatise by Horton Soto, um, he talks about, of course, Menger's understanding of the development of money, which is spontaneous, which doesn't require a central planning board, which happens when human beings get together and organize. And of course, among other things, it solves the problem of barter. So I'm quoting DeSoto here. He says, Menger discovered that institutions appear through a social process composed of a multiplicity of human actions, which is always led by a relatively small group of individuals, who are the first ones to discover certain patterns of behavior, help them attain their goals more efficiently. There's an unconscious social process of learning by imitation, which explains how the pioneering behavior of those most successful and creative individuals catches on and eventually extends to the rest of society. And I think we understand intuitively that's how language evolved before most people were literate. There were oral traditions, and so imitation, no doubt, was a big part of that. And I'll get back to quoting Soto. Although Menger developed his theory in relation to the origin and evolution of money, he also mentions that the same essential theoretical framework can easily be applied to the study of the origins and development of language, as well as our present topic, judicial institutions. So DeSoto mentions language, which I think is pretty fascinating, and then he goes into a lengthier analysis of common law, which I think all of us would agree is evolved and spontaneous and preferable to this top-down positive legislative law. So why can't we view language the same way? Um, and not just DeSoto, Hayek had recognized. He talked about this in a couple of different places in his books, but he basically says there are three spontaneously organizing institutions in society, and those are law, language, and money. These are the spontaneous institutions in society. So, and he laments the fact that while law had an opportunity to develop as common law, and while language had an opportunity to develop without too much, perhaps, direct state interference, money had been almost immediately seized upon and corrupted by that's monarchs or later governments. So Hayek too recognized that language is one of the spontaneous institutions of society, and that's really what my paper was trying to get at. That language is an institution, like all institutions. It evolves organically over time, but it's also subject to corruption and capture by political agendas. So we might say that natural linguistic evolution, bottom up, might be compared to a marketplace of language, operating like a laissez-faire economic system, while corrupted or imposed changes to language might be compared to state intervention in this marketplace. And my paper goes into a lot of what I would call imposed language, whether that's in context of politics, economics, whatever it might be. So I examine the question of linguistic evolution versus corruption in the context of social sciences, particularly politics and economics, starting with Orwell's concept of meaningless words, um, the linguistic demands of the social justice movements, Hayek's mirage of social justice, the rise in what we call woke messaging from corporations and central bankers. Uh, and basically, my paper concludes that many of these linguistic changes, which seem to be occurring very rapidly across the English-speaking world, are not organic, not spontaneous. They're not even well-intentioned. They're imposed by elites with political agendas. And the analogy I make is to intervention in an economic sense, intervention with markets. So I mentioned the idea of considering some sort of interdisciplinary work between economics and linguistics. Now, there's not much out there, but there is a pretty interesting paper written by a gentleman named Daniel Heber. He is a PhD from UC Santa Barbara. He has a website. I've never interacted with him or emailed with him, but I cite him a couple times in my paper. Um, he works a lot with native languages, the Chitimacha tribe of Louisiana, to revitalize their once dormant language. That's what his website says. He also works with some other Plains Indians, Navajo, Mixtec, Swahili language communities. So he clearly has an interest in some of these perhaps dying or dormant tongues. And based on his website, I would generally say he appears to be sort of politically on the left, but I haven't been able to track down where he may be working or something like that. But he wrote a paper back in 2017, which is called Praxeology and Language, Social Science as the Study of Human Action. And it's actually a really fascinating paper, and he shows a pretty darn good baseline understanding of the central tenets of the Austrian school. I mean, a lot of the papers about Austrianism, and so he starts off the paper saying, well, there's this thing called praxeology that the Austrian school developed. And he basically posits this is the method for all social science, which is not something that maybe a sociologist or a political scientist might agree with, probably most linguists either. And he starts off with this fascinating quote from Theory and History by Mises. He says, Mises notes that language is not simply a collection of phonetic signs. It is an instrument of thinking and acting. So a big part of this paper is all about not just the scope of praxeology per se, but language as action. And perhaps we don't think about that. We think of means ends, and we think of felt uneasiness and the action axiom and everything, but we don't really think of talking, writing, or even thinking in speech and that. And so let me quote from the paper real quick. He talks about Mises distinguishing praxeology from psychology. And then he says, this clarification, in other words, we're kind of interested in observing what people do descriptively. We're not trying to figure out their inner motivations like strengths, right? So, and I'm quoting Mr. Heber. He says, this clarification yields the first important implication of praxeology. Economists and other social scientists are interested in describing human action, goals that people have as they are, not as the social scientists themselves believe they should be. In other words, the social sciences are fundamentally descriptive rather than prescriptive or normative. Mises himself makes this position clear in several passages. He's talking about theory and history. So it's pretty interesting to see, several pages in an academic paper discussing praxeology. So, not only does he talk about how man must act if he wants to attain ends, he has to use language, for example. He also, Mr. Heber also goes into really the scope of praxeology, that it's very broad. that it is value-free, that it unites the social sciences in terms of method, including linguistics, and that this value-free descriptive property is very, very important, and that other social scientists ought to follow it. And I'm quoting him again. Thus, in this first implication of praxeology, we see one way in which the praxeological approach unites the social sciences within a common framework. All social science deals with the subjective goals and values of individuals. So it's getting into subjectivism as well. And the actions those individuals undertake in pursuit of those goals and actions. In order to study these actions scientifically, the social sciences must take the underlying motivations as given and adopt a descriptive rather than prescriptive approach to human behavior. So, that's pretty interesting. I took, I think, one linguistics class in college, and I recall it because most of you are too young for this, but when I went to university in the late 1980s, um, there was such thing as a 7 o'clock class. And I had linguistics at 7. And back then, sometimes I just stayed up all night and went to class. I certainly couldn't do that these days. But nonetheless, I don't remember hearing anything about praxeology. And so he gets back to this idea of, since all speech is action, that means that scarcity and economization of speech are a thing, right? We have limited means, we have limited resources, we have limited time, and we need to economize. And so, and we have time preference. Like anything else, speech has diminishing marginal utility. And when you're a little kid, your mom is nagging you endlessly. You tend to tune her out after a little bit, right? I mean, like anything else, you can have word inflation, and so there's an opportunity cost to speaking. Whatever you're saying to someone, uh, there's the opportunity cost of what you're not saying to someone, uh, and so language has utility as a result of all this. But nonetheless, we have to apply the same sort of means ends calculation, economization, time preference, diminishing marginal utility, opportunity cost. We have to apply all these frameworks to speech, which is a pretty darn interesting concept. And to my knowledge, uh, it's a point that nobody else is really making, and perhaps he's only made once here in this paper. And again, he's kind of hard to find, and doesn't seem like he's out there very active. So once we get beyond all of these personal elements of speech and economics, the interpersonal between two people, then speech becomes exchange. It becomes cooperative. So if interpersonal exchange is the fundamental social relation, then linguistic exchange, quoting him, is the social relation par excellence. So really the beginning, the opening point of almost all human interaction, maybe a handshake or something, is speech. So speech is exchange, and like other exchanges, it takes place on a voluntary basis for mutual benefit, right? And so he goes into a little bit of a diatribe about how linguistics tends to view, like a lot of social sciences, which might be dominated by left-wing thinking. He says linguistics tends to view all interaction, linguistic or other, all interaction, linguistic or otherwise, excuse me, through the lens of hegemonic power relations rather than voluntary exchange. But, he says, the linguistic producer is ever at the whim of the linguistic consumer, provided there is no violence or no imposition. So that is really starting to sound like something, I don't know, Murray Rothbard would say or something like that. I mean, I really, that really made me think a little bit differently about the idea of how we use language each and every day. So he concludes, Mr. Heber concludes, he says, with a praxeological approach to the study of language, you have to situate linguistics within the larger project of the social sciences, clarify the common object of study. Humans act at ends within the context of society. And that really starts to sound like an economist. And so praxeology is just a narrative. There is a logical story. You start with the action axiom, we take something that is a priori true, and we sort of work backwards and smaller, deducing our way into insights. And so let's congratulate Mr. Heber, and I'll try to find out more about him and perhaps draw more attention to him if I can find some more of his work or maybe connect with him via email. I haven't been able to just yet. So apart from this sort of interesting intellectual question of speech as action and speech, linguistics having sort of the same underpinnings praxeologically as or sharing some of the underpinnings of economics. So why should we care so much about this? Well, if we're interested in Austrian economics, presumably we're interested in truth and truth claims. So, language is an important subfield of praxeology. Like Mises said, it's not simply a collection of phonetic signs. It represents an instrument of thinking and acting. So language is an important component of an individual's means and reasoning. It's important in Austrian methodology, I would say. Axioms, economic axioms, logical deductions made from them require precision and agreement in language. And we can see this parallel between imposed language and interventionism. So I would argue that economics would benefit from considering a similar conception of plan versus spontaneous language, just like plan versus spontaneous money. And in philosophy, which we can certainly make the case that economics is a subset of philosophy, surely we ought to demand precise language, particularly when it comes to knowledge, right? All of our justifications for knowledge, all of our knowledge claims rely on truth, evidence, belief. And these concepts, in turn, they require a common language. We all agree to express and define them, right? We all agreed upon definitions of words. Now, in the physical sciences, although I think postmodernism is seeping its way corrosively into the physical sciences as well, but nonetheless, in the physical science, we have things like we have ways to measure force and mass, velocity and volume, rate. Inch is an inch, gallon is gallon. But when it comes to economics, we have all kinds of words that perhaps are not used as precisely. And so when we have relatively static definitions and meanings which evolve slowly over time, sort of agreed upon changes like common law evolution in law, then that gives more coherence to our philosophy. And words can just change on a whim because Kamala says, it's equity, not quality. And all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? That's a very different conceptual thing. Then it's awfully hard to make truth claims because basic building block of any truth claim is words which underpin the argument itself. So I'll leave you with this. Who owns and controls language? Have you ever thought of that? You probably have not. Well, it belongs to all of us. They're all users every day of language. So ideally, governments, politicians, academics, think tanks, journalists, religious leaders, elite institutions shouldn't possess the tremendous power to control language. Like market processes, language should evolve without centralized design or control. Only this natural evolution, across time and geography, can reveal the actual preferences of actual language speakers in any society. Evolution, of course, is just. Evolution is efficient. Evolution is fair. But language is an institution, and like any institution, it is subject to corruption and capture by those with political agenda. So my discussion with you today, the paper I wrote and the paper that Mr. Hebert wrote, I would say urge greater awareness and understanding of this distinction between spontaneous linguistic change and the imposition of language for an agenda. And let's not forget, there are institutions which those of us who are just individuals on this call today don't have much control over, right? I mean, you might not be able to change Harvard much. You might not be able to get into Harvard. You might not be able to become a professor. Big institutions that have a lot of money and power, things like the New York Times, things like the two political parties. There is all kinds of institutions in American society and in the West, which average people might feel pretty helpless to change. But language, I would argue, is something each and every one of us use every day. We are all foot soldiers. We're all in the trenches whether we know it or not, there's sort of this slow, cold guerrilla warfare going on to shape words into dubious meanings at best, perhaps evil meanings at worst. And so we all ought to be more mindful and conscious of the language we use. We ought to use words precisely. We ought to use words carefully, and we ought to fight back against this linguistic interventionism that feels increasingly powerful in society. And that way, each and every one of us can help claim and reclaim the institution of language as something that belongs to us, that belongs to society, that is spontaneous. And just like we don't want intervention in economics, we shouldn't want it in language. So, with that said, Rich, I want to thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank everybody for participating today.
Well, thank you very much. We do have a couple questions from the chat here. The first one here comes from Odo Nobunaga, I think is how I pronounce it. Anyway, he asked, do you think traditional academia is still the only way to contribute, or have autodidactic pursuits supplanted it?
Well, I'm a little long in the tooth to go get a PhD in economics. So I'm going to have to say, I hope that academia is not the only way to participate or to promote Austrian thinking. So, and as I mentioned earlier, there are people really changing hearts and minds. People like Safety Namus, whether you're a Bitcoin maxi or a Bitcoin skeptic, you can't deny is that he has reached a lot of people and brought Austrian economics to an audience not yet reached. Uh, people like Lynn Alden, people like George Gammon, people like Bob Murphy on Twitter. I mean, that's where some of these arguments are happening. And just like nobody knows if you're actually a dog sitting behind a computer, uh, it feels like nobody knows if you have a PhD. And I know that Per Violin and others, they sometimes lament this, and justifiably so, that there's half baked knowledge and half truth sometimes in the Bitcoin community about money and interest rates and banking and other things. That can be, this democratizing of influence can be a very bad thing when dummies or people who have no knowledge or wrong knowledge gain a big platform. But the flip side is that it gives us all of us humble lay persons a chance too. So, I mean, if you're not a PhD, if you're not in academia, there's never been a better time to nonetheless have some influence.
Next question here comes from Freeshine, and he asked, interesting question here. Do you have an opinion on bimetallism? If so, do you support or oppose the system, or do you believe in a chiefly gold standard system?
Well, bimetallism failed. For starters, created a lot of problems. It created a shitcoin in the current vernacular. But gold won out for a reason. There's comparisons to bimetallism, I guess, in the altcoin world, because you could presumably have people buying Bitcoin because they think numbers go up and store a value, but yet there's some other coin, Monero or some, I'm not that up on them, that is actually easier for day-to-day use or transactions. I mean, you could see something like that. That's kind of how silver worked for a while. But my opinion is that the world really wants one money. I mean, it just does. And for a long time, that was gold, and now it's basically the U.S. dollar. And I don't know what happens next, but I think the world wants one money, and let's hope that it's something that the market decides and not some collection of governments under the auspices of the IMF or the World Bank.
Next question here comes from James, and he asked, how would you view the role of expectations in language as relating to the Austrian conception? And he adds he's always made connections between Wittgenstein and the Austrian school on this topic.
Expectations in language. Well, that's I'm not sure. Uh, it's a question that really involves this sort of collective or comparative this collective understanding of words and meaning. We live in a society now where everybody's looking for meaning. Nobody's looking for truth in reality. And so I think it's our job to sort of cut through that and use language like a sword, and not be politically correct, not be woke, throw cold water in people's faces when they need to hear it, and read it. That's the message today.
All right, we have another question here from Cinex. Okay, here it is. He said, how best should one resist attempts to control language usage by states and societies?
Well, I think we're at an inflection point. We have to resist furiously. And it's not just about being nice, right? We all understand it. Um, there's a million little ways every day that we might fall prey to. In other words, if you say, oh, uh, my spouse, well, or my partner. Well, I don't have a partner. I didn't open a law firm. I have a wife, right? So there's a million little ways, but that we can all resist, and that might, you're not being mean to anyone. You're just not letting them dictate the terms of your language. We see this a lot in the LGBT lexicon and some of the demands of that community, but don't kid yourself. Hate speech laws are coming. Hate speech laws are a very real thing in the United Kingdom, in Canada, close neighbors, Anglo-Western Magna Carta countries. Free speech is not a universal by any means. Uh, it's not that universal even in the West or even in the United States. You could go out and poll average Americans, and I think you would find a very solid 1/3 of them like, yeah, you ought to go to jail for hate speech. So I may sound a little Pollyannish, and just saying like, well, whether you say spouse or wife, that's not really going to get you in jail. But I do think that the bigger question is whether imposed speech or curtailed speech in the form of actual criminal prohibitions are going to come to America, unless we sort of shake up folks who are under 30 years of age. I think there's a very, very, very good chance that we will end up with the same kind of speech laws that Britain and Canada have, and that that an evolving membership on the Supreme Court will start to view First Amendment protections as just sort of, not the linchpin of a free society, but just one consideration to be weighed against other interests, as opposed to sort of an absolutist view of First Amendment. I think that's coming, and I think that's pretty scary.
One last question here before we let you go. In just over 2 weeks now, Donald Trump is going to be sworn in as the 45th president of the United States. And even as I say that, it sounds kind of surreal to say. Are you optimistic for the next 4 years of Donald Trump being in the White House? Are you pessimistic? And what kind of things do you think we could expect?
Well, I'm pleased he won because not because of him or his purported policies or his personnel. I'm not real fond of his personnel, but I'm pleased because it just shows that a significant number of Americans, 70 some million, maybe 80 some million Americans, were willing, just like they were in 2016, to not vote for what I see as a plain evil in the form of Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton. So, in other words, the left is just so bad, in my opinion, that it needs to be soundly rejected. So I'm pleased in the sense that there were enough Americans willing to sort of go off script, and the script being that progressivism is just like what people were saying in the 20s and 30s, socialism is inevitable. Progressivism, the sort of progressive neoliberal social democracy, is just inevitable. There's no stopping it. That was a very powerful message right up until, I'd say, about the early 2010s, 2015, 2016, when Trump and Brexit came along. And that was the wisdom. It was still Francis Fukuyama end of history stuff. So in that sense, I'm glad Trump won. I don't think he's inheriting a very good economy. I think things are a lot shakier than uh, than the journos admit to. I think that these problems are baked into the cake. Some of them he baked himself. When, back when he was president, and he did the first round of those absolutely ridiculous fiscal expansions to combat COVID. That wasn't the Fed, that was literally just Congress at Trump's urging, creating trillions of dollars So that, there's a lot of, I think, inherent problems in the economy. And so if if things go south during his term, will that sort of be blamed on capitalism? I don't know. It's hard to say. Um, Obviously, he has a fetish for tariffs, which will be would be inflationary in the CPI sense of the word. Um, and he doesn't seem much to understand that there's a structure of production, there's a temporal element to getting goods and services to people, and that we want higher order goods. But he's a populist. He is what he is, and so my optimism is not so much with Trump or his policies. My optimism is that the American people seem to feel like something's really off, and I hope that that spurs more of them to new thinking. And new thinking is where we could come in with what we consider the correct answers, the correct approach to organizing not just an economy but a society. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of people are rejecting the status quo, because the status quo is no good.
Thank you very much for speaking here with us today. Do you have anything to plug, and where can people here find you at?
I have nothing to plug. I am on Twitter, just at Jeff Deist, all one word.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.